You meet girls and they want to be an actress like you. What do you tell them?
Become a person. You have to develop your own uniqueness.
Faye Dunaway in one word.
An inspiration.
Undismissible.
Complicated.
This is the worst seat in the world.
She's difficult, but caring. Before you make judgments, you have to look deeper. You see a Faye Dunaway movie and you don't see Faye Dunaway. You see Bonnie Parker, Laura Mars, Joan Crawford.
Faye is the persona, and Dorothy Faye is that little girl from the South.
It's ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Welcome back to another episode of Ticklish Business, the podcast all about old Hollywood. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Kristen Lopez. And this week we are going to be sharing our audio interview that we did with Faye Dunaway documentarian Laurent Bouzereau. You might have already heard it if you are a patron, but due to our current schedule, we are actually sharing it with everybody. You can also see the video over on our YouTube channel, but this is going to be the audio version with him. Before we get to that, though, we'd like to remind everyone that if you haven't subscribed to the Ticklish Biz Patreon, then you should. We do additional podcasts like doubled features looking at remakes, based on a true podcast looking at biopics and true crime, as well as But Have You Read the Series, spotlighting classic literary adaptations. We just finished our Don Johnson July series. We had a lot of fun with that, talking about The Long Hot Summer and Born Yesterday. We have a bunch of episodes planned between now and the end of the year. We also give out regular packages of gifts, host exclusive interviews, and let you guest on an episode. You can subscribe starting at just $1 a month at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And don't forget that Emily and I are both authors. You can currently buy my book, But Have You Read the Book, and Emily's Viviana Valentine Girl Friday mystery series wherever you buy your books. Plus, our Redbubble store has some fabulous art designed by Samantha Ellis and Terrence Hilt that you can get on a variety of different items throughout your house. It's also where you can find our always popular Jean and Judy Makoko mugs and more. You can find that at ticklishbiz.redbubble.com. And if you're ever looking for an old episode of our archive, you can go all the way back to episode 1, which is always free at ticklishbusiness.podbean.com. So I'm going to stop talking and let Laurent do the rest of it. This is our interview with Laurent Bouzereau, the director of Faye. So if you have not seen Faye, you should definitely see it. It's a fantastic documentary, and I don't necessarily think there are any spoilers, so you should be fine. Let's turn it over to Laurent. Hello, Laurent. It's so great to talk to you again. I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course, Kristen. Great to see you. How are you?
Yeah. It's awesome that we get to talk about Faye. I think the last time we talked about Natalie Wood, so you were just going through all of the classic ladies that I love. It's a generic question, but again, because you did the Natalie doc and now you're doing this, what compels you to kind of look at the women of this era? What inspired you to want to tell Faye's story?
Well, I grew up in the 70s and fell in love with movies in the 70s. So I have to say that Faye Dunaway was central of my film education. And the films she starred in were benchmark movies. They weren't just great films. They were unforgettable movies. And they were movies that were major benchmark in cinema history. So that makes her part of a movement in cinema that I think has never been equaled. And she was very much the go-to actor to tell very complex stories and complex stories of women. And so I really felt that I wanted to pay tribute to that. I had a friendship with her son, and we talked about it through the years, about doing this, and finally had a chance to sit down with Faye and sort of exchange ideas about what this could look like. And of course, as anyone in their right mind would be, she was reluctant. I would
sure.
At the same time, she's a very courageous person. We've seen it on the screen. The films that she makes are always courageous roles. She tells the story, of course, of everybody telling her not to do Network because she was a so-called unlikable character. But, so I could see that while she was reluctant to participate, there was also an attraction to it because it was a challenge, right?
Yeah.
And for the first time, she was working without a script. So we embarked on that. And frankly, I try to do films that challenge me as well. I try not to do things that are just too easy. It needs to have, a few bumps on the road in order to tell a great story. So that's exactly what that was. That whole experience was extremely challenging. And, I didn't want to do a vanity project. I wanted to do something that would make a difference, that would be somewhat stirring and different. And listen, it's up to everyone to decide if I succeeded or not, but something I'm very proud of.
What's fascinating about the documentary for me is, Faye ironically feels like such a public figure. We hear about the lows, but at the same time, watching the documentary, I was shocked by how much I did not know about her personal life because she is, ironically so, a very private person, so I didn't know about her relationship with Marcello Mastroianni, and I didn't know about, her relationship with Terry O'Neill and how that marriage worked out. And for you as the documentarian, I mean, you're right that there is this kind of possibility of letting the subject take over and dictate what is going to be told. How did you approach? Did you have things in advance when you were kind of blocking out the story that you wanted to prove or disprove? How did you go about balancing the personal life with the public and kind of breaking those walls down to show a side of her that I don't think most people have ever seen?
We had discussions, and there were three real interesting things that she had never discussed before. And that was, of course, her bipolar disorder, which she's struggling with to this day. And while not wanting to be a poster child for it, she really wanted to share aspects of her journey with it, because it's something that, had she been allowed to talk about it in the past, during that time where she was making all those films, in the same way that athletes and other actors, or personalities are talking about it today as they're growing into their own fame and work, I think would have been a very different experience for her. So that late in the game for her to have the courage to acknowledge that she is responsible for her action and that she has acted up, and that and yet that she has had that personal journey and discovery of that condition, was very important for her to talk about it. Then, even when she wrote her autobiography, she did not mention that Liam was adopted. And I was always curious about that, not in a way that was gossipy, but I was just curious, why did she want to keep that private, secretive? At first, she didn't want to talk about it. She said, I won't talk about it. And I said, okay. I said, fine, and I immediately didn't make any comment, didn't try to push. I immediately got into another subject, right? And then the next day of a second day of filming, out of nowhere, we just finished a specific topic, and suddenly she says, I want to talk about Liam and the adoption. And she started crying and delivered this monologue about it. And the whole crew, I mean, I had a very small crew, but we were all crying, basically. And I knew at that moment that I'm telling a very relatable story, because if I'm getting those emotions, hopefully when people watch it, will have the same amount of emotions. And the third thing was really Mommy Dearest, because a lot of people, and I have to tell you, we had the movie at the Cannes Film Festival, and the day after the premiere, we had press together, and a lot of reporters and journalists, and I'm not going to blame them, but they constantly want to talk about this. Now, when you've had the body of work that she's had, it is really painful to ever have to focus on something that was not a good experience and is arguably not a great film. It's a great performance, but it's not a great movie, come on. So I knew it was going to be tough talking about it, because it's not a pleasant subject, right? And yet it's something that everybody wants to know about. The way in was really the discovery of those Polaroid shots of her transformation. And I love her reaction. She's like, "Oh my God, that's the Crawford stuff." She's so funny when she said that. And suddenly she opened up about it because I was approaching it from the work side, not from the gossipy, painful part, and then she went there, but I let her dance with me and guide me to it. So that was sort of like the stuff that I felt if we don't talk about that, it will feel shortchanged. And also, she knew I was always filming and recording and was cool with it. And I felt that if we opened the film like this, because she was, I mean, literally what you hear and see is the reality of what happened. Then I felt now is my job to, in a way, redeem that behavior or explain it and share it. Again, as she said, I'm responsible and you're welcome to call me whatever, but I don't mean to be that way, So that's a very long-winded of answering your question.
Takes me into, I wanted to ask about the Mommy Dearest stuff because yes, she's historically said she doesn't want to talk about it. And what I loved about the doc, I'm interested to hear you talk about it a little bit, is you got Mara Hobel, who played little Christina. And we love the movie on my podcast. We celebrate, Faye's performance in the film. But to hear Mara talk about how it's sad that Faye doesn't love the movie because they loved making the movie. And I know I've read that there's a whole director's cut of additional scenes that might have made the film a bit more serious. For you, I mean, what was, I guess, talking to other people about Mommy Dearest and finding out that, I mean, for me as a millennial, I think I came to love Faye because of that movie in a weird way, because she's so good in it.
Well, it's interesting because, again, I saw the movie when it came out in France. I was still living in France. It was called Maman Très Chère. When you have grown in the 70s, watching Network, Chinatown, Bonnie and Clyde, even Eyes of Laura Mars, Rio de Condor, and you get to Mommy Dearest, it's a huge disappointment.
Yeah.
You're like, you can appreciate a performance, but as a lover of cinema, that was definitely not something that I liked. And in fact, that director, Frank Perry, is someone who had made some interesting films in the beginning of his career, but then made Mommy Dearest. And then he makes a movie called Monsignor with Christopher Reeve that's equally a disastrous. You get really angry at the director. You're like, okay, Mommy Dearest was bad enough, but now you got freaking Superman and Geneviève Bujold and some incredible actors. You have John Williams making your score, and you tank just again equally. So for me, I do not like the film, but I do recognize that her performance is extraordinary. Although it really feels that she is playing it without the support and the guidance of the director. And I think she says this very clearly in the film, in my doc, that maybe it was, she is a force. She's
right. Yeah.
And you better have a good reason to tell her to do something because she's extremely smart. I mean, really, really smart and educated and knows her history of actors and the stage and all that. So you can't just say, hey, can you pull this down, or can you do this, or can you do that? You really have to justify it. And she is, so I could see that maybe he was the wrong director for it because, you look at something like Sunset Boulevard by Billy Wilder. Well, it's actually kind of a similar story, except it's a fictional character, but it's a similar story. It's just as outrageous. You got a dead man telling you the whole story, right? And she is as much of a sad caricature of a star gone by. And so there is a way to make a film about that thematic. And it would be actually very interesting, Kristen, to do a remake of Mommy Dearest,
Right?
but with the right director. And it would be interesting to see how in the right hands, with the right vision, this story could have been told. So I don't mean to really destroy Frank Perry, which I just did, and I apologize. But I do feel that I understand why it's annoying to her that a lot of people quote that film as their favorite because, and I think Mara says it in the film, there's people who think it's like this camp classic. Well, you don't want to be known for a camp classic, but then there are the people who really saw truth in the story and related to it in a way that was extremely disturbing, know. But I really understand if she had at the very beginning of Mommy Dearest literally falling apart, even when it came out, if she had embraced it and said, listen, I know I'm going to get a lot of, but she resisted it. And I think, unfortunately, her resistance to talk about it just fed the sort of, the frenzy around it and the sort of mythology around it. Because, there are a lot of other movies that went a lot worse and could hold a candle to this in a much bigger way, but we don't talk about them because they're forgotten. And here they just she was also at an age where she had such incredible hits that I think that people were they can't wait to bring you up and then they can't wait to tear you down.
Yeah.
And there's aspect that is extremely sexist also, by the way, because you have actors of her generation making horrible films like Ishtar, for example, with Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty, where no one is talking about Ishtar and no one is making fun of Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman past the fact that it tanked, but no one's talking about it. So it makes me very passionate because I really think that there is a bit of a stigma to Faye as a result of Mommy Dearest, and it's not necessarily one that's deserved. It should have been, what it was, but I don't think she should have been villainized for it in the way that I think she was.
Yeah, I think it's said in your doc, that it came out too early, and I think that's really what it is because now, we do a whole side podcast on old Hollywood biopics, and you look at biopics from the 70s and 80s, a lot of times the stars were still living. They're very peppy. A lot of them are false, they're very happy depictions. And this was the first one to say, like, those stars you love, they're flawed. They're human. And I don't think people, especially, the lead into the Reagan 80s, were really wanting that, which
Gable and Lombard.
Oh, Gable and Lombard. I mean, exactly. Yeah, that's the gold standard of old Hollywood cheese right there. It was interesting for me because I kept going back and forth, with the Natalie Wood doc in terms of both women were very much lauded for their beauty and their vitality, and then having to make that pivot to what happens once you turn 35. And Faye is very much candid about the changes that went in her career as she aged. Do you see any commonalities between Natalie Wood and Faye? I mean, do you tend to kind of gravitate toward particular subjects that have something specific?
No, because I don't really. I think they're very different. The story of Natalie was really more an attempt for me to tell the story of a family and a family dealing with a tragedy and in the eyes of the media. And, use that, of course, as an excuse to also shed a modern light on her extraordinary, career and life. But Faye was more, about, for me, a portrait of what I would call really a pure actor. I don't think there's anybody else like her since her ever like her. She really, I believe that she is the only woman who has 3 films on the list of the top 100 best films of the AFI.
Yeah, I could believe that. Yeah.
And I really think that of that particular era, if I was making a film, I would want Faye Dunaway. So no, there was no, listen, I'm attracted to telling stories of cinema because it has been my life. But I also feel that I want to approach them in a way that is much more relatable, that the stars are one thing, but there is Earth. And that's the story I'm excited about telling, as opposed to what you look up and is, beauty and I want to tell the truth and in a way that makes them relatable and even more likable and even more of an inspiration. It involves telling sometimes very hard, tough stories. So yeah.
And you're doing a doc now on John Williams. You have a book coming out on De Palma. As somebody who is writing 2 books right now and is having anxiety attacks every day, I have to ask, what tips can you give me? How do you juggle all these different subjects and formats?
Well, I'll tell you, I definitely relate to anxiety. But when I was literally editing Faye during the day and also filming John Williams and writing the book on Bryant and pitching this new film that I actually started filming yesterday on Jaws. So it was really the busiest, and I'm very grateful, that I've ever been in my life. But it meant that I get up at 4:00 in the morning and I write, I would write the book between like 4:30 after coffee and after really shaking myself until about 7. Then I would go to the gym for a solid hour and to clean my brain. And then I would go either to the set or to the cutting room. And I tend to try to end my days like around 6-ish. And either I watch a movie or I read my book or we have a dinner or something nice because I know I'm going to have to get up super early. So if I keep working past 6, my brain then won't shut up,
I know that feeling.
So, but it was really hard because the book on Brian, I only had like 7 months to write and it's just really hard. I mean, that is extremely hard, because you're by yourself, as you know. And even though I had a fantastic editor, it still is a very solitary kind of thing. Whereas, with the documentaries, I'm not the editor. I have an amazing editor on Faye, Jason Summers. And in production, my husband / producer, is taking care of the production. I can show up on set and I have a story producer. So I have a great support system. And so the filmmaking side is always very much more collaborative. The book, your mistakes, the mistakes you'll make in the book are really solely your mistakes.
Yep.
No one to really help you. It's hard. It's super hard. I have to say this was the hardest year I've ever had in my whole life.
Have you joined Ticklish Business Patreon? Well, you should. Just like Allie Moore, Amy Hart, Danny, David Floyd, Donna Hill, Gates, Jacob Howler, Jonathan Watkins, McF, Rachel Clark, and Shawn Goodreau. Listen to episodes 48 hours early, watch exclusive video interviews, receive merch, and even guest on an episode. You also get access to bonus series like Based on a True Podcast, doubled features, and our latest series, But Have You Read the Series? It's all at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And if you're in Los Angeles on August 25th, be sure to stop by the Los Feliz 3, where Emily and I will be introducing the 1934 comedy The Thin Man. It's part of the American Cinematheque's Friend of the Fest. You can purchase tickets now via the American Cinematheque website. Back to the show. Yeah, book writing is very much in your head. You spend a lot of time in your own head going back and forth, whereas I'm assuming with the doc, at least you have images, you have something to look at, as opposed to the blank page where you're like panicking yourself, being like, I need to fill this something.
And the
anything.
word count. The word
Word
count.
count. Yep.
Oh
Oh
my
yeah.
God.
Yeah. That's
Oh
where
my
I'm
God.
at right now on book one is word count because I'm woefully under. So,
Oh,
you know,
you're giving me PTSD. Just hearing you.
exactly. Hearing your process, I'm just like, this is sweat inducing, but I maybe I should try this for a couple months and see if it works. So if I try your method, I will let you know if it
Oh,
kicks my
good.
ass into gear. You know, I mean, I always tell people Faye Dunaway, I feel like I would love to sit at her feet and hear her talk, but I would probably be very intimidated and probably cry. You got to interact with her, of course, working on this. What is something you learned about her that you didn't know before as an actor or as a person, just sitting with her, hearing her share stories?
God, I mean, the list is so long, but I think that what I learned is kind of a confirmation that art is very difficult, and living by your art either make you or break you. And sometimes it does both, you know. And she is very much someone who has lived her art form to a level of generosity that has really impacted her life.
Yeah.
And I think she's realized that it's impacted her life in great ways and potentially in sometimes, like not in such great ways, because she lives it to an intensity that can be extremely tough. You put yourself out there and you're criticized and you're mocked, or suddenly you get an Oscar. So it's everything in between, when you achieve that level of work. I also learned that she's someone who is kind of fearless, but very much needs to be in control. This was a documentary. She didn't have a script. And I think that was unsettling. I think she had amazing relationships with certain directors who were there for her, but I think I tried to be there and to really instill in her confidence that she was telling an amazing story and that we were going to do good by her, because I wanted her to trust me. And I think we accomplished that. And we had a wonderful time in Cannes. And I had promised to her, because, Cannes is our favorite place in the world. So I had said, wouldn't it be great, Faye, if we went to Cannes? And, it was interesting because the head of the Cannes Film Festival, Thierry Frémaux, is a super nice guy, but he's a super tough guy. And what I mean by super tough is like they don't show films that don't deserve to be there.
Right.
He watched the film, and of course, he's very much like most French people, totally insanely in love with Faye and her career. She was the face of Cannes. And he called me and he said, and I'm not, I'm just saying it was really important to get his blessing that we deserve to be there. And I felt it wasn't a favor that he was doing to my producers, being Amblin, and to Faye because he liked her. He felt it deserved to be there. And when we were on the red carpet, it was pretty humbling, made me feel like, you know what? She deserves to be there. And that made me feel good that it was the value of the way we told her story that got us there.
What I always am fascinated by, you mentioned, this kind of 3-film run, or the entire decade of the 1970s is just so iconic. Do you have a favorite Faye movie or a movie that you've come to appreciate more working on this documentary?
Oh, definitely my favorite would have to be Network.
Yeah.
Because the message alone in Network, this is where we are today.
Yeah. It's pretty much a nonfiction at this point.
And what I think is remarkable is, even though it's a movie about television, it's so cinematic.
Yeah.
And it is so pure and so raw. There's no music in the film, aside from the jingle that announces the Howard Beale show. It is so cinematic. Do you know that Faye is never in a scene with Peter Finch?
Yeah. Yeah. Now that you mention, I don't. Yeah, that's amazing to hear out loud.
At one point, he's on TV and she is in the control room. She's not in the scene with him. And yet, when they were promoting the film, I have the lobby cards. Faye pointed out to me on the lobby card that she gets top billing over Peter Finch and William Holden and Robert Duvall. She's like, oh, look, I have top billing. And she signed all of them for me. But in the package of the 8 lobby cards, as it was customary, there's one of her with Peter Finch talking to one another. Clearly behind the scenes still, because they're never in a moment together. But so from a cinema, and I knew Sidney Lumet. I cannot say enough about Sidney Lumet. Loved him as a person, as a filmmaker. To me, he was someone. It was very different from some of the other directors I loved, like Steven, Brian, Billy Friedkin. Like I would say were like my 3. They can do a film about wallpaper, and I will go see it. but Lumet was there, and he was very different from any of those guys. And Lumet told me something that was so interesting when I talked to him about network. He said, you never, ever know how it's going to turn out. And you just have to have a good time making it.
It's funny, though, that she got top billing. It just makes me think of how when I think Humphrey Bogart and Ida Lupino did High Sierra, that Humphrey Bogart didn't want Ida credited in the same way as him. I think she's credited either first or second, or they're on the same line. He didn't like that, which I think goes to what you were saying, too, about the sexism of that time. She treated her career like any man would. And in the second wave feminism of the 1970s, we've discovered people didn't like that as much as they claimed to.
And yet, the thing that I really like about Faye is that she's not militant about it. Mm-hmm. She's very discreet. Let me do a film like Network and show you.
Yeah.
But she's not, and she's very much for it, and she's very much in approval of the movement and all that. But she's using her own art form, her own language to convey the message, and leave it to her to create 3 or 4 completely iconic women in cinema to make sure that message is sidelined along whatever else is happening in the world, because as Julie Solomon says in the film, even though Diana in Network is not what you'd call a likable person, she was as entitled as any man would have been.
Yeah.
And that's what the power of that role is. And that's why Faye wanted to play her.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, this is a lean 90-minute documentary. I'm sure you could have made this 3 hours, and I probably would have loved it. Is there anything that you wanted to include, but just for time or where the story was going, you couldn't?
I am very conscious of people's attention span today, including my own. I always remember Hitchcock's, famous joke saying that the length of a film should never exceed that of the capacity of the human bladder. And I really feel that lives really well at 90 minutes. And I work extremely close to my editor, Jason Summers, who I've been with for a long time. And he keeps me extremely rigorously, honest, because I write a script prior to where it's very structured. And then, of course, it morphs as we cut. But we have a very strict, journey. And each quote that I bring in, I have to justify it with a title so that we know that we're evolving with the story. And so there are always what we call the rabbit holes, where, how come we're not stopping to talk about this story? Well, because, we're already past that. Now we're talking about something else. So it's a very liberating. And as I said earlier, it's a very collaborative effort because, it could have been 6 hours. And trust me, there is enough material to do that. But I think that there is a big difference between wanting to be encyclopedic about something and telling a story, right? And when you tell a story and you're following a really specific train of thought, a very specific structure, you find that being encyclopedic and definitive about something is not the goal. Is to really capture people's imagination or people's attention and hold them for an hour and a half. And anything longer than that just feels like it might not necessarily belong. So I try to be between an hour and 30, an hour and 40. John Williams is about an hour and 40 minutes. He's lived pretty much almost 100 years old. So
Right.
it was even more challenging with John than with Faye. I told my editor, I really wanted to live in that. So that was the goal. And then, but there are no compromises. We don't suddenly feel like, oh my God, I just wish. I don't feel that way. And I want to add also, Kristen, that I really have a close relationship with my producers, Marcus and Daryl and Justin. And I have to say, it's rare, but HBO is really fantastic.
Yeah.
They not only have they given me, this is my third movie with them, not only have they given me a platform to tell my stories, where you'd be surprised the number of people who passed on Natalie Wood, on Mama's Boy, and on Faye. The number of places they are in the trenches, and at the same time they're extremely respectful. And you always hear of horror stories about notes and everything from studios, but with them they don't send you a memo. We watch it together, and we talk, and that challenges you as a filmmaker to justify every single freaking cuts. And that's been, to me, like, when you say what have you learned, I learned a lot of my own craft and my own subject, and Faye was no exception.
One book I'm working on right now is about an HBO show, and I've heard from a lot of people, no notes. HBO does not give notes, which I'm very happy to hear is consistent today as it was in the early 90s. All comes back around.
They give you notes, but they don't give them in the sense of sending you a memo. It's just a creative discussion.
Sure.
And it goes both ways, like where I've had, sometimes they say, oh, can you do this? And I say, well, you know what? I will try, because I see values in what you're saying. But if I end up not liking it, I will revert back to what I did. And I've done that on a number of occasions. And because of that sort of mutual, like, sort of fun relationship and mutually respectful relationship, has been a great time. I'm very spoiled.
Well, I mean, you are, to the old Hollywood community at least, kind of becoming our Kevin Brownlow in a way, whether that's talking about Faye or Natalie or John Williams, Jaws. Is there a subject, an old Hollywood person you love to do a documentary on before your documentary days are over that you haven't gotten to yet?
I try not to think about those days are over. I stick around for a while longer, but yes, there's tons of stuff I want to do. I mean, the list, Kristen, is but it's interesting, things come in very different ways. John happened at the right moment. I've known John 30 years. I've been trying to do this with him for 30 years. So it happened at the right moment. And there are other, not necessarily, it's not necessarily old Hollywood that attracts me. It's clearly like people who have had an impact on me. So sure. Sometimes, it's classic Hollywood. I don't like that word old. It reminds me of my age. But classic Hollywood. And sometimes it's more contemporary. Like I told the story of Dustin Lance Black, in Mama's Boy. And I have to tell you, that journey was extraordinary. And that was kind of a little bit of a Hollywood story, but it was really a human story, I have to say, there are a lot of criticism toward the sort of format of biopics, and sure. People feel like they're vanity projects and they're predictable. And so I have to fight that sort of stigma that sometimes those films have. And it's interesting. People are so eager to put you in a box, because I've done a lot of documentaries for home entertainment. It's how I started, and I'm very proud of it. I did it before anybody else was doing it, or I was part of a small movement there. People see me as that. They don't want to see me as someone who has, arguably done other things. It's fascinating, even at my level, because again, I don't see myself as, I don't have any notions of grandeur, but it's interesting that regardless, you're put in a box, and then you have to fight your way. And so I'm very conscious about that when I'm selecting a film to make, because I want to evolve also. I don't want to be necessarily just known as the guy who does Hollywood stuff, even though I should be so lucky to do this for the rest of my life.
As a sidestep to the previous question, who are the actors? What are the films that you love just in general? Who are the stars that, outside of the ones you've done docs on, that just stick with you?
Well, I would say that to me, anything by Steven Spielberg.
Sure.
I have a lot of admiration for the cinema of Brian De Palma, particularly the 70s. I think his visual language is something that really informed me on the power of cinema. But the one that's my go-to cineast is Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah.
And anything and anyone who ever taught Alfred Hitchcock. So, whether it's Grace Kelly and to Tippi Hedren and Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and those films, I cannot stop watching them and learning from them. In fact, I'll tell you, I just challenged myself. I rewatched Psycho.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen it, I don't know, 200 times. And I challenged myself and I said, what have I never noticed in Psycho? And I can tell you the list is long, but I'll just give you one little example. I never understood why the film starts, with this view of Phoenix, Arizona. And it says Phoenix, Arizona. Well, what is Phoenix, Arizona? I'm like, who cares where it takes place, right? and Phoenix, Arizona, what is it? Well, it's a desert. It's super hot. It's dry, and it's hers where she lives, Marion Crane, Janet Leigh. Well, where does she get when she gets to the Bates Motel? She arrives in rain, she gets killed in the shower, and she gets buried in a swamp, which is the opposite of her world. So that alone told me that Hitchcock very deliberately wanted you to feel she enters a different world. And that's why she doesn't recognize it.
I love that. I love that. Now I'm going to go watch Psycho again and try to see what I haven't noticed after all of my time. So, oh my gosh, Laurent, it's always great to get to talk to you about anything, let alone Faye Dunaway. I'm excited for more people to get to see the documentary and the other two you have coming and read your book. You show me how it's done. So I need to quit complaining and finish the 2 books I got. So
good luck with yours. I can't wait to read them.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, from your lips to my computer.
Thank you so much. Take care, Kristen.
Once again, we thank Laurent Bouzereau and the studio behind Faye for making that interview happen. It was so great to do. That's going to close out Ticklish Business for this episode. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Reviews matter, so consider leaving us one on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify of 5 stars. You can follow the podcast on all social media, including Twitter/X at Ticklish_biz, as well as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. We are getting better at posting there, which is at Ticklish Biz. You can follow me at KristenKLopez.com or subscribe to my Substack, which is KristenLopez.substack.com, and I'm on all social media at KristenLopez88. And Emily Edwards is always at Ms. Emily Edwards. Our Patreon helps keep the lights on at Ticklish Biz HQ and gives us chances to do new things, like that Don Johnson July. So become a subscriber and show your support at patreon.com/TicklishBiz. We will be back to you with a new episode on September 4th, celebrating my birthday, talking all about the 1969 historical drama Anne of the Thousand Days. See you then.